So I'm from Belgium originally. I have a Flemish-speaking father and French-speaking mother.
Louder, louder.
And I moved here 20 years ago. Forgot all my Thai in the process. And I'm the founder of the P2P Foundation, which is a non-profit organization which is global, and we study distributed infrastructures. So that's what peer-to-peer means, right? The capacity of any peer to connect with another peer and do projects and together. And so we study how that applies to politics, to business, to spirituality, to basically everything. And in that context, I am a friend of Gibin, who used to be at the Karl Polanyi Institute Asia, and is now with the Institute for Global Economy. But I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it. No, okay. But he will now explain his own background. So Gibin is a lot doing global economy, global politics, and so we discussed together many times about our comparative insights and how the world is moving.
Thank you, Michel. Hi, everyone. My name is Gibin Hong. I'm from South Korea, and I used to be trained as a political economist for dealing with global finance and global trade and so on. But I never went to the academia, and I worked as a researcher for a research institute for more than a decade, and I used to work for the Karl Polanyi Institute Asia, which was institute founded for disseminating the idea of the 20th century Hungarian-born economic thinker whose name is Karl Polanyi for Asian countries, but not anymore. But I'm still working in his line of work, and today I'm going to speak about the possibility of a chaotic transition of a global system, starting from the COVID crisis and especially after the Ukraine war. And I am a friend of Michel in terms of we made friends in the context of discussing what would be the alternatives of this chaotic global order of the political economic system and so on. And I do believe that his idea of the P2P and commerce movement will be a strong candidate for alternative form of a new political economic system. So I hope that my presentation today is going to be could be a good introduction for his own idea of a P2P and commerce movement. Thank you. Okay, let me begin. I have 3 points to make. That is about the past and present and future of our global system. And concerning the past, I am introducing the idea of the Peter Pogani, the political economist whose name is Peter Pogani, another Hungarian. His idea about the global transition, that is the first point, and what has happened in the global system in 19th century and 20th century. And in the second part, I am going to interpret what has been happening in the recent 2 years, starting from COVID crisis and going through the Ukraine war nowadays. And what's the meaning of the inflation, and what's the possibility of the coming crisis of the energy transition regime and so on. And in my third part, what we should do and what we could not do in this time of crisis. And in this context, I would emphasize the significance of the P2P and commerce movement. That's the structure of my small talk. Well, it doesn't sound small, but main idea is simple. Okay, let me begin with the first point. What is the global system? It is not just the usual name. It is based upon the idea of the thermodynamics. Maybe you might have heard about the second law of third thermodynamics, which is also called the law of entropy. And economist named Peter Pogani. He died in 2014, by the way. And he introduced the idea of the thermodynamics into explaining the rise and demise of the global system since the how should I say, 18th century, say. And his idea is very simple and very complicated as well. But let me talk on the simple side of it. All the systems in the universe can be categorized into three ones: open system, closed system, and isolated system. And the categorization is according to the whether there is an exchange of energy as well as matter. And I would avoid explaining about what does it mean. And one important point about this is our global economic system is in its view isolated system, and isolated system in all the isolated system in the universe is following the law of alternation of the two period. First period is dynamic stationary state, where some kind of equilibrium or some kind of balance power is prevailing. Although it is very dynamic, it is always moving, but the whole shape of the whole system is predominantly kind of a balancing and strengthening itself. But when the degree of entropy reaches a certain limit, that period is ended, and the whole system is going into the second stage, that is the chaotic transition. And when chaotic transition is ended, it can reach into a certain new type of dynamic stationary state, but the new one is entirely different from the first one. So it's indirectly related to the evolutionary law of evolution in the biology. It's a kind of a transition, evolution of the ecological system into first one and second one and third one and so on. And in his view, Peter Fogarty's view, we could distinguish some kind of the same type of stages in the history of the global system. And the entropy here, in this case, entropy means the size of the matter that is being organized in the global system, the global political economy, including population, number of the people, and the size of the matter that are being organized in the global economy. That size of the matter is the first element. Second element is the intensity of the organization that is being measured by the amount of the information that are being shared among the different centers of the global economy. And according to that measure, we can distinguish three different stages. First one is a very rudimentary state of the global system that can be called a mercantile economic system, starting in the 16th century in Western Europe, especially in the North Atlantic Sea, like England and France and so on. And that period lasted until the end of the 18th century. And when the entropy of that system reached a certain limit, that system went into a kind of a chaotic transition period that started with the French Revolution in 1789 and lasted until the final defeat of the Empire Napoleon in 1814. So that was the chaotic transition. And after the chaotic transition, second period, actually the real first global system emerged in the 1830s. That is so-called laissez-faire global capitalism under the dominance of the British Empire in 19th century, laissez-faire capitalism. That lasted until the 1914. And when there was a certain, intensity there, like imperialist separation, the division of the global world at the end of the 19th century and so on, it entered into another chaotic transition period that started from the First World War. And chaotic transition period lasted until 1945, when the Second World War ended. And those 3 decades were period of enormous upheaval and pain and tragedies like fascism and communism and World War and so on. And after the 1945, we saw the second global system rising in the Pax Americana. And this form of capitalism is not exactly the same as the laissez-faire capitalism in the 19th century, more government intervention and more social protection and so on. But as the globalization in the 21st century reached a certain level, the intensity level and the size of the matter that are being organized and communicated in the global system nowadays is enormously high. And that is when Peter Pogani died in 2014, he said that sometime during the period between 2013 and 2030 might be the beginning time of the another chaotic transition. And I strongly suspect that COVID crisis might be the beginning of that kind of a systemic chaotic transition. And let me go into the second point of my talk. That is the interpretation of what has been happening in the past 2 years since the COVID crisis. What we have been seeing is a very typical type of series of sequence of matters and events and incidents. That is what I called feedback loop. Okay, I said that it is very typical because this kind of feedback loop is a clear sign of the systematic crisis and systematic collapse. Okay, let me explain about this. What this feedback means. We usually think about the sequence of the causality, cause and effect, as a linear thing. The cause, effect 1, effect 2, effect 3, like this linear thing. But what if effect 4 is the same thing as the cause, the ultimate, the first cause? Then we see this kind of a circular type of a loop of causality. This is what we call the feedback or circular and cumulative causation. In other words, if some aftermath is again strengthening the first original cause of this whole sequence of events, then we see the endless movement of the causality. Okay, and there is two kinds of tendencies in this feedback. One is convergence and second one is divergence. If feedback is converging, then it is going to strengthen the whole system. But when it is diverging, then it is a clear force of destabilizing the whole system. Okay, then what I will say is we have seen two feedback loops formation since the COVID crisis in the global system. First feedback loop is the geopolitical disturbance. Well, I don't think I have to have a lot of time explaining this. You know, this conflict between the United States and China did exist before the COVID crisis, even in the time of the Obama administration. But COVID crisis was the clear starting point of that kind of a conflict is emerging out of the surface and is dramatically aggravating. And at the end of very recently, we have seen this kind of a changing balance of power between the two powers was opening the new opportunity for Russia to jump into the game. And what we are seeing is the Ukraine war, and we are seeing the possibility, not just a possibility, almost a predictable future of a geopolitical picture is getting more and more complicated. So this kind of a feedback loop of the geopolitical disturbance is already formed, in my view. So it is strengthening itself more and more and more. And the second feedback loop is the commercial and financial crisis. One very, very important consequence of this first feedback loop is the disturbance in the commodities market, energy market, and food market. And that happened by the middle of the 2021. Of course, we have seen the crisis, the rising increase of the food crisis is the 2009 and so on. But this was the time, 2021 was the time when market as a whole, global market as a whole, clearly begin to recognize there is a serious problem in the price making in these three indispensable things: energy, food, crisis, energy, food, and raw materials. And this increase of three basic things have been creating the global trend of the inflation, rise of the inflation, and stagnation as well. And everybody and everywhere in the world, we are talking about inflation nowadays, which we assume that was entirely dead in 1970s. Since the 1980s, we have been suffering from the fear of the deflation, not inflation. But all of a sudden, inflation has come back. We've been talking about it. And one direct consequence of it is the U.S. government, not government exactly, but Federal Reserves, hike up the interest rate recently, and then created a huge outflow of capital from the developing countries and many other countries, and it created I would say total mess of the global capital markets nowadays. Nobody can predict what is coming out of it. And we are now talking about a 1% rise in the next meeting of the FOMC and Federal Reserve. So can you believe that 1% rise? Not just a 25 BP, just 100 BP. So nobody can predict about this future possibility of a global and commercial globalization. And it is making picture aggravating more, because if you see the collapse of the belief, market provides all. You can provide anything from market, and you can always invest into the global capital market, and you can always get some profit out of it. If that kind of profit is collapsing, then it will regenerate the conflict, geopolitical conflict, and social conflict, and upheaval of the developing countries as well. So first, the feedback loop is going to be at strength because of this kind of a financial and commercial collapse, the crisis feedback loop. And it is also going to strengthening itself. So we are seeing the possibility of runaway inflation, kind of out of control kind of inflation in this coming years. And we cannot predict how the Federal Reserve, will prepare and react to this kind of situation. Nobody can predict anything about this future of the globalized commercial and financial globalization. And what I fear most is the possibility of the third feedback loop being formed. That is the crisis of the energy and climate transition regime. You know, the global civil society, including governments and corporations and so-called civil societies, until the beginning of the COVID crisis, we think we have made some kind of global consensus that we should make it to net zero situation by the time of the 2050. Otherwise, we are doomed because of the climate crisis and carbon crisis and so on. And it goes without saying that that kind of a roadmap in the 3 decades requires a close cooperation and working together of all the governments and all the corporations and all the global civil society and so on. We should, we should make an agreement about the energy regime and how to make a plan to starting from here to there by the time of the 2050. And now we have 2 feedback loops. So that kind of international cooperation regime is gone. Now, not entirely gone, but very unclear at this moment. And this second type of second feedback loop, that is a commercial and a financial crisis resulting huge rise of inflation, is also making a huge turbulence in the energy market, and also food market and every other things in the world. And for example, the countries like Germany, which was very keen on making it to the 2000 net zero plan by the 2050, they should face the possibility that they should reactivate their own coal power plant and nuclear power plant maybe. So the situation of the energy crisis and the climate crisis, and the picture of it is entirely changing. If it makes the third feedback loop, it's going to strengthen the original cause of the first and second feedback loop, and we see the small cycle of the feedback loop one, and bigger one of the second feedback loop. And if we see the formation of the third, the bigger loop, a circle of the feedback loop 3, then it is going to make a chronicle situation that our global system as we know it is going into a chaotic transition. And of course, there are fourth and fifth and sixth more of unfortunate feedback loop making possibility exists, but I would not talk about it anymore. Not because of the time limit, but because I'm not going to ruin your evening. So anyway, so my last point. Then what we should do about this? First, I don't want to dismay you, but the law of thermodynamics is not something you can fool with. It's not something you can avoid. I mean, when the system is entering into the stage of the chaotic transition, there is nothing that can be done to prevent that. It's the system's work. And another thing that we cannot do is to use all the traditional things as a solution to deal with that situation. Because in this type of situation, all the solutions that exist cannot be the answer. Let me take an example. When there was a second chaotic transition that started with the First World War, after the First War ended and there was a Versailles Treaty among the great powers in the European world, and what they tried to do in the 1920s was, unfortunately, trying to revive the laissez-faire capitalism of the 19th century. They tried to revive the international gold monetary system. They tried to build the balance of power among the European countries and so forth and so on. So they should have known that kind of old type of solution cannot be the way out from that kind of cul-de-sac in the 1920s. But this thing became clear by the time of the 1930, when there was a Great Depression beginning and the rise of fascism, not only in Italy but also in Germany beginning. So during the 1930s, all the attempt to revive the 19th century capitalism was just gone. And everybody was into a new type of political and economic system like fascism, communism, and New Deal, and a Swedish type of social democracy and so on. Maybe we should do the same thing. We should forget about the... now, this might be a too big a word, too strong a word. We should do something about this. This is our aggravating situation. But we should focus more our energies and our resources on the emerging order. All the chaotic transitions period is implying some kind of seed or rudiments of the new type of order emerging. The key thing is how to recognize it, how to distinguish it as soon as possible. Let me take another example in the 1920s. In that enormous time, that time of enormous confusion and problems of the 1920s, there were some ingenious people who were recognizing the significance of the industrial democracy, guild socialism, and economic planning, even in the 1920s context. And people like G.D.H. Cole and Ernst Wigforss in Sweden, and some other socialists who were talking about the entirely new type of order of economic and social order. Of course, their voices were ignored during the 1920s, but in the 1930s, their ideas were adopted by almost all the major industrial countries in the 19th century context. So industrial democracy and economic planning and the domestic national autarky became a kind of a norm during the 1930s. So if only we could have shortened the time that we recognize the significance of the new emerging order, we could have avoided unnecessary pains and problems of the global system. So maybe that's the same thing we should do right now. That is, maybe we should forget about going back into the good old time of the global financial capitalism of the 2002 time before the 2009. We should forget about it, and we should forget about itty bitty small things to solve the huge problem of social inequalities by using more social spending. Of course, it is important, but it cannot be the ultimate solution. We should focus more upon the possibility of an emerging order whose seed form is already here with us. The only thing we need to have is to eyes wide open and minds wide open to these new emerging order and possibility that are implied in there. In this context, I would introduce idea of the P2P and commons movement, which my friend here, Michel Bauwens, have been active for more than 2 decades in disseminating over the global world. So I think I should exhaust most of the 30 minutes that are allowed to me. So maybe I should stop here and shut my mouth and introduce my friend here. What's the idea of it?
So I think I can start with maybe some examples of the systemic transitions that Gibin was talking about, and especially the really big ones, to kind of see, what happened in these big transitions, and maybe there's something we can learn about it. So, of course, the first one that comes to mind is the end of the Roman Empire, and I think what Gibin didn't say is that you have a stable dynamic system, then you have the chaotic transition. What comes out of this can be more complex or less complex, right? So we can transition to a system that can carry even more information and can deal more densely with matter, but we can also transition to a system which simplifies everything, right? And I think Rome is a good example of that, right? So Rome is a very sophisticated trading system, military system, city system. But what comes out of the Roman transition is actually a much more simplified political and social system. So we have, for example, ideologically, I'm from a Christian background myself, and I respect that tradition. But if you compare, let's say, the pluralism of Roman philosophy with the dogmas of Christianity, especially in the beginning, and it's clearly like a simplification, right? When you compare the Roman cities with the feudal system that replaces it, it's clearly a simplification. And so I just want to say that this is a clear possibility, is that we come out of a crisis in a much worse way, in a certain sense, than so there's no guarantee that we come out of it better. So I think that's important to know. Okay, the second example, which is less known, and I explained it in my interview, and most people are fascinated by this story because nobody knows this story. But Europe went through a revolution in the 10th, 11th century. And there's a really good book about it called The First European Revolution from Richard Moore. So what happened? So 8th century Charlemagne tries to revive the Holy Roman Empire, but it doesn't work. So when he dies, they have 3 sons, France, Germany, and Lotharing in between. And it leads to a kind of decentralization and collapse of the Frankish kingdoms. And so what you have is castleization. So every little baron makes his own castle, exploits his own peasants. And it leads by the 10th century to really a very bad situation where there's a lot of abuse. For example, the knights steal gold from the churches, and the lords, they rape and they pillage, etc., etc. So in 975, the monks of Cluny, with the peasants behind them and the Holy Mary in front, start confronting the feudal class with their sins. And they win. So basically, that leads to a social contract with 3 rules. Make love, not war. So the feudals promise to marry each other rather than always fight. Primogeniture, the oldest son gets everything, so you don't have to fight within the family. And the commoners, the people, lose the right to hunt for meat. And paradoxically, this will create peace, relatively, compared to before. And it will force the peasants to produce more grain because they have less meat. And this will create a surplus which recreates the cities that are emerging in the 11th century. And within 70 years, 70% of the European land is agriculturalized by the Cistercians. Thousands of guilds are created all over the continent. Commons, land commons, are contractually created by farmers in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in northern France, and in Switzerland. And you have an extraordinary growth period in Europe, which will lead to a doubling of the population over the continent and a tripling in the West. So that's a good example of a transition which leads to something more complex, more rich. By the way, in 11th century France, the people had a 5-day working week with Sunday and Blue Monday, the day of the family. And the skeletons of women in the south of France are taller than today, which is a sign of a really good diet. So these people are doing well, right? So this is, then will collapse again in the 14th century, right? So then we have the third transition that we know of, which is the Reformation in Europe. And maybe we will notice already some kind of common ground. So, okay, so a crisis of complexity is a crisis of too much differentiation. So, for example, printing creates an enormous explosion of knowledge sharing, which can no longer be controlled by the old institutions, right? So the old institutions lose their legitimacy, and there's a self-organization taking place, and new institutions, you know, this is what you mentioned in seed forms, right? So what typically happens in a transition is fragmentation, right? The old ideologies, the old glues disappear. Paganism for the Romans, for example, and the Catholicism for the 15th century, while the old ideational glue, which holds society together, dissolves. And instead of that, you have this multitude of Reformation sects and cults. And for example, the Puritans will say, oh, we cannot have ungodly people in power, right? So total delegitimation of power. And the way we get out of it in the West is by inventing capitalism and the nation state. Now, I myself more of a lefty, so I'm quite critical of this. At the same time, I think we have to recognize that this was actually a way to go up. Why? We'll get out of the system, and they're doing it maybe because they think about it and they have, you know, other ideas. But a lot of people simply cannot survive in the old system. Think about Rome going from 1 million to 80,000 people in I don't know how long it took, but it didn't take that long, you know, for the cities in late antiquity to completely dissolve, right? So you just couldn't survive in the city. So where do you go? Oh, well, I go live around a monastery, or maybe I look for a lord who can protect me, and I become a serf, right? But that's the exodus out of the old system, and they're looking for new solutions, right? So feudalism, even if we dislike the system, was actually a solution from the chaos of a declining imperium, all right? So what I'm arguing is that distributed technologies today are the key for the new seed forms. And think about how civilizations emerge. So let's take Mesopotamia. If I remember it right, you know, you have the Ice Age, and then you have like a drying up of North Africa and a swampification of Mesopotamia. And you have the estuary, right? It's all like little territories, and each of them decides to kind of discipline nature, you know, and create these temples that will manage nature. and they create cities. Right, that's the beginning. So actually the beginning, I think it's called synoesis. It's just villages who voluntarily abandon their village to live together in a bigger village. That's the birth of the cities. And then the cities solidify when you have mining. You start having armies and all of that. So actually, civilization is not agriculture. It's actually mining. That's when civilization really starts. And then they federate. So the early city states are federated, like in the city states in Greece. And only after that, when you really get like the third estate, and they make alliances with the kings, and then you get nations and empires, right? So typically what you have is a new organizing system that allows people to organize in a different way, and then they interconnect and they scale. And so the big difference today, and this is very important in civilizational terms, because what is civilization? Civilization was a solution for agriculturization and sedentarization, right? It was, how do we organize country and city? And that gave class society and all of that we know under civilization. So essentially it's a geographical arrangement, apart from many other things, but it's a geographical arrangement. So think about what we're having today. Today we have invented non-territorial coordination. This is not a mind changer, it's a system change, right? So suddenly civilization is faced with a really new challenge, which is how do you organize geographic communities and non-geographic communities? This is what is happening. I don't know if you know the book Network State from Balaji Srinivasan. It's really interesting. He's a bit of a venture capitalist and stuff, but he has really interesting ideas, because what they are doing is they're creating network states with their own money, and they're looking to buy geographical entities, right? They're negotiating in Honduras, in El Salvador, and they want to create geographical cities that are owned by network states. I'm not sure it's going to work out. That we'll see, right? But I'm just saying, this is what we are going through today. Apart from the negative story, what we are seeing is seed forms, right? So think about capitalism. What is that? Well, the invention of purgatory, right? Because if you're a Christian and Jewish and Islamic, by the way, you cannot lend money. It's sinful. Usury was just interest, not high interest, right? So purgatory means, oh, well, I'm Christian, lending money is really not such a big sin, and I can buy an indulgence, and then I can get rid of my... So in other words, I can do business and banking as a Christian, right? So this is a very important change that enabled capitalism to emerge. Printing, double entry book accounting, right? So these are the seed forms that interconnected gradually to actually create, it took a long time, 400 years, to actually create a fully dominant capitalist system. So today we have the peer-to-peer dynamic, which is the capacity of people all over the world to freely connect with each other, to not just communicate, but self-organize, and actually also create new value systems. So I know a lot of people are critical of the blockchain. I am as well, actually. But I see these systems as seed forms of open and transparent ecosystems of collaboration at the non-territorial level. But as soon as we have distributed ledgers, shared accounting systems that are open and transparent, right, we are actually already in production. We are linking, accounting is the link between ideas and actual physical stuff, right? And so this is, I think, the seed form of today. So what we're seeing is people, especially in 2008, it started in a lot of cities, and I done study of the city of Ghent, the Flanders, the Netherlands, and Catalonia. What we see is a tenfold increase in urban commons. So in Ghent, there were 50 in 2006 and 500 in 2016. That's an enormous growth, right? And so what are these people doing? Well, they're saying exactly what you're saying. If we cannot rely on the traditional market to get our food, if the state is becoming too poor to do it for us, then we better find a way to do it ourselves. So they're creating urban gardens, community land trusts, and then doing this for housing, for transportation, for every single provisioning system. So if you live in Ghent today, you have a choice between public provisioning, social housing, private provisioning, buying a house if you can, but young people can't do it anymore. It's finished, it's done for them. And the third one is actually commons oriented, right? So cooperative housing, co-housing, and that's growing at a furious rate. So this is what I mean with peer-to-peer. So the capacity to self-organize, and I think it's a civilizational alternative. Now I'll give you another idea around that. Wars are not just war between countries. Wars are wars between systems. World War I was a war between the nation state and the empire. What died with World War I was the imperial systems, the Ottoman Empire, Austria-Hungary. World War II was a war between three alternatives to manage the industrial system: the fascist system, the communist system, and the industrial democratic system. Those were the three, and okay, the Soviet Union didn't die then, so it took another 89, right? But this is what World War II was about. So what is Ukraine about? This is my view. Ukraine is a war between the maritime, mercantile, finance-dominated, rentier capitalist Western system against the state sovereignist Russia-China axis. And so this is part of the chaotic transition. We now have a split between two systems. We have reached peak globalization already in 2006, I believe. So global trade is going down, and people are now organizing in those two blocks. And unfortunately, I think Europe has made terrible mistakes by choosing this path. You know that the euro is collapsing. It's now lower than the dollar, and it's very simple because the US-European system did stuff with SWIFT and taking the assets of Afghanistan and Russia, which destroyed the trust that Europe and that the West was a good steward of the global system. That is now dead. So that means that more and more transactions are happening outside of the euro, which means there's less demand for the euro, and the euro is collapsing. And paradoxically, the ruble is actually going up, right, despite all the sanctions. But here's the problem. Both of these systems are based on rivalry and war, right? Competition, financial competition for one, and war between states for the other. And this is part of the chaotic transition. Unfortunately, I don't see any record in history of people saying rationally, oh, we should do it differently. What happens is they have a terrible war, and then they say never again. So think about Napoleonic War. Europe was devastated, millions of dead, and then we have 100 years of peace and a five-fold increase of working class salaries over 100 years. Because we had the war. Because the war destroyed the continent, they said never again. Why did we have the welfare state and multilateral organizations? Because we had World War II and people said never again. So yes, it started in the 30s with the New Deal, but basically became the standard, right? And so part of the new transition is, first of all, looking at the seed forms, which I think are commons-oriented and peer-to-peer. And so what we have is an international state system and a transnational finance system, which has eroded the state system, right? As a reaction, we have a sovereignist right-wing populist movement, which wants to reinforce the state against the market. And that's what happens in Russia, but also in Hungary and Poland, and with right-wing populist parties in Europe. And they now have massive working class support. Massive. The RN in France have 50% of working class vote, and the other 50% doesn't vote. The left is the party of the cognitive urban class. Highly educated people living in the rich neighborhoods of Paris and other cities. The left is down to 25%. Look at what happened with the yellow vests, the Canadian truckers, and now the Dutch farmers. So what we are seeing now is the end of the left and a reactionary working class movement which wants to maintain its living standards and sees green as the enemy. I'm not saying they're right, but I'm saying that's what they're seeing or what they believe they see, and that's what is happening right now in Europe. So I think we will have a reactionary wave in Europe, especially, you know, because I think they made mistakes by doing the Ukraine thing. And in the US, every opinion poll is showing that the next midterms will be an 80-year unprecedented victory for the Republicans. Think about the last elections in Texas. This is a county that has been Democratic for 100 years, that voted 20% in favor of Obama, and that has now voted 30% in favor of the Republicans. Minority voters are switching at a very rapid rate to the Republicans. So this is the reality. And I'm not saying this is good. I'm just saying this is happening, right? So this is the bifurcation that we see. Okay, well, I finish. Cosmolocalization. So if the market system is imploding and the state system is not really the answer either, I think what is happening is that we are moving towards something that I call cosmolocalization. What does that mean? It means a relocalization of production. More and more, we see these seed forms of people taking control of local production. But that's not enough. Because let's say you're a fishing community in Africa and you say, oh, we don't want this global market anymore. Well, I'm sorry to say, but just outside of your miles, your national miles, there's a big Russian or American or Japanese ship, and they're just fishing all your fish. So pure localization is just not an answer, right? So what we need is building counterpower. And since we have transnational finance and transnational finance and international state system, what we actually need is interconnected, common-centric civic systems. So we need localization connected with global open design communities, which are the coordinating mechanism for the knowledge flow within these open design communities. And this is already happening. I don't know if you know this, but 17% of the US economy is today common-centric. Hard to believe, right? But here is an example. The NOAA, the Oceanic, right, gave its information in the public domain, became a commons, and on this basis it created a vast market of geolocation business. All these businesses only exist because of the commons. They couldn't afford it, and in Europe this is not happening because they actually auction the geographic information to big companies. Right. This is why you have 400,000 geolocation workers in the US 10 years ago, and you had like 300 in Europe, right? So don't think the commons is anti-market. Actually, the commons is a basis for very vibrant economies. And if you look at medieval European economies, what you have is guilds, which are associations with collective machinery. You have land commons, but they are market actors as well, right? But the market is embedded within the commons. This is what I'm concluding. So markets and states are extractive institutions based on conquest and growth. They always overdo it. So there is a cycle well documented in different books like Peter Turchin's Secular Cycles, which show that the average length of a civilization, and now I'm not talking about Chinese civilization, but I'm talking like the Han Dynasty or the Qin Dynasty, right? Like the particular form, is about 300 years. After 300 years, they have exhausted their territory, and then either they travel around, so the capital changes, like in the Maya civilization, or in China, you see the capital change, or they're run over by a barbarian tribe who starts over. Okay, what was my point here?
Yes.
So, oh yeah. Okay, so when that happens, you have a reaction, right? The reaction is, and I call this the pulsation of the commons. People who are local, who need their soil to survive, will generally connect to some kind of spiritual reform movement. And they will reinvent the commons, re-strengthen the commons. So this is what happened after the Roman Empire. The commons came back in Europe. Japan, 16th century, and I'll end with this. Okay, Japan, 16th century. So you have a whole century of civil war between the different warlords. Within that situation, you have Pure Land Buddhism, which is basically a commons church. The farmers are armed, they manage their own communities, and they have a system that is described by Elinor Ostrom like a commons management system of the land. Then the shogun wins and will create the, what's it called again, Tokugawa? Yeah, okay. So what happens? He will destroy the church, replace it with Zen, which is to pacify the warriors, because they have nothing to do, right? He creates a Versailles in Kyoto, forcing the lords to come and spend all their money. He forbids wheels, so they have to hire people. It's good for the economy. So he impoverishes the lords. He creates a thriving society. Why do I say that? Because for 250 years, Japan is and this is very rare, is a flat civilization. So they live within a fixed population with a fixed thermodynamic. The only reason it stopped is because of the West, right? They saw the gunboats and they thought, okay, if we continue like this, we're dead. But it was working. And that's good news because it shows we can do it. Okay, we might not do it in the same way because they actually killed their children. And I don't think we want to do that today, but we're not making children anyway, right? So might not be a problem. Okay, so cosmolocalization for me is a new arrangement between land and non-territorial coordination. And do I have all the answers? No. But how do we get the answers? By actually looking at the people doing it. And this is what the P2P Foundation does. We have 23,000 articles about the emergence of P2P in commons forms today all over the world. And so as people are exiting a dying system with, losing legitimacy of institutions and more and more authoritarian answers, that's what they're doing. Because look at politics. Politics are dead. I call this, I didn't invent this word, but non-movements. Look at Sri Lanka. Look at Occupy. Look at 15M. Look at Arab Spring. There are no longer politics. These are uncoordinated, angry people, and they are atomized. So we no longer created fascist movements, socialist movements. And that means that politics is not the answer. The only thing they want is get rid of the existing elite. But if you don't have any ideas about what the new elite should be doing, you just have a new elite doing the same thing, right? So I think the answer today is actually much more in movements like Saryodava in Sri Lanka, who have 300,000-400,000 people farming and living in an entirely different way and being sustainable since 30 years. So I think this is basically what we should be looking at. And I know it's not easy. You can't film this, but I'll do it. Oh, you're filming me. So this is what my wife says about me. Why do people want to listen to you? You can't do anything. Right? So anyway, so I'm not a good person to talk about the actual practice of these things. But I think we need organic intellectuals who are people that actually are connected and watching these bottom-up grassroots movements and helping them, doing what they do and trying to share their lessons, and so that all the people doing the same thing can actually learn from each other. And this will accelerate. And this is my last word. So you have to know, this is my trick. I say 10 times, this is my last word. So my last word is this. Look at Napoleon. Look at the Russian Revolution. Actually, these things are pretty fast, right? So you have a crisis, and the crisis is painful, really lasts 10, 15 years. And then suddenly we live in another world, right? Who would have thought that Napoleon would have spread the bourgeois legal system all over Europe in just 5 years? Who would have thought Lenin would have created a system that would last for 80 years and governed half of Europe and still is, to a certain degree organizing China and Vietnam and Laos, right? Who would have thought that? Just in a few years, right? It's not as easy, but you get the point, right? So I think we're now in for 10, 15 years of chaos and suffering and death and many things. But if we keep our eye on the other side, right? And Viktor Frankl, when he wrote Man in Search of Meaning, said in the concentration camps in Germany, only two kinds of people survived: the communists and the Catholics, because they were the only ones capable of projecting the future beyond their suffering of the moment. Everybody else committed suicide or let themselves die. And because they believed in the same thing, they also could organize and create solidarity amongst each other. So these were the only two groups that survived the concentration camps, because they could look, at the other side, the light at the end of the tunnel, hoping that it's not another incoming train. And with this optimistic anecdote, I stop. Thank you.
Now, you all were talking about Sri Lanka, right? And Sri Lanka catastrophe was man-made, right? Begins with an N, like Napoleon, no less, and not like like nature of particle, like second law of thermodynamics, right? Sri Lanka collapse was something of a mystery. That between your ideology, can you explain what happened in Sri Lanka? And then in terms of like chaos to organize, like it's in terms of decentralize to centralize, right? And we're talking in one of the most centralized country on earth comparing to its economic size, right? This is the context. Please, one each maybe, contrast, compare Thailand to Sri Lanka.
Right. Okay. So maybe I could give some of my idea about that.
I think.
All right. So well, I cannot. I don't know everything about the universe, but let me share my idea about it. I know that Sri Lanka has its own history of politics and its domestic situation, and that makes the picture very blur and complicated and so on. But unmistakable fact about it is the real one instant that triggers the event was the outflow of capital out of the country because of the hike of the interest rate by the Federal Reserve. It dramatically aggravates the economic situation and foreign reserve system of the Sri Lanka, and it just makes the situation worse and worse. And let me take another analogy about how the World War started. You know that Prince Ferdinand, as far as I remember, his name was Ferdinand the Prince. Anyway, that guy was assassinated purely by accident. Assassins were actually abandoning the possibility of assassinating, but all just by some accident, the prince was his car was just going through in front of the assassins who was eating his own dinner. So all of a sudden he jumped into the car and shot the guy. In the normal situation, that kind of accident cannot be, expanded into a world war. But when the chaotic transition is beginning, some small incident could be, expanded into a huge thing. Maybe the same thing might be the case of the assassination of the former Prime Minister of Japan, that Abe Shinzo guy in the last week. Yeah. It might create a huge significance for the future of the Japanese politics and the geopolitics and so on. So that is the thing. So accidental things happen every day in the world, every day in our life, in our world, but only when the systemic chaos is going to happen, that small thing might generate a huge impact upon the universe as a whole. It is what they call so-called butterfly effect. So what we are now seeing, I'm very scared to see when I heard about the assassination of the Abe Shinzo guy. These interval of the very major incidents in the global world, the interval is getting shorter and shorter for the past 2 years. I don't know what would happen in the next week, and I don't know what would happen in the coming election in the United States politics. So I don't know much about the Sri Lankan context and the Thailand context, but what I have been talking was the the situation of the global system as a whole. It is a kind of a full of, volatile possibility. Yeah.
Can I say something? I just want to add, because there is one spin around the Sri Lankan crisis is that it's because they had green policies. That's what some people are saying is that's why they are. But actually what happened was they didn't have any money. And so one of the bad decisions was we can't import fertilizers. And of course they gave the green spin. They didn't do much other green stuff. And then agriculture production started going down with 20 or 30%, right? So sure, you can say it's a bad decision. Yeah, but the bad decision was prompted by a context, which made them panic. And so can you really blame Kerensky in the Russian Revolution for not saving democracy? I don't think so. Probably couldn't do anything about it because there's certain moments in time where an individual is just powerless because the systemic forces. And there are other moments in time, like Napoleon, who felt imbued by some kind of divine duty. Suddenly one man can have an extraordinary effect, right? But maybe a year later, that Napoleon wouldn't have emerged. So I'm just saying I agree with, we have to look at both, decisions, agency, but always within the context. Yeah.
Kevin, how would you articulate that emergent order that we're just starting to perhaps become aware of? Is there a concise kind of way to describe what that is or what it looks like?
Okay. I'm not a prophet. So if I say that I know something about that emerging order, then the moment that I say that, I became a kind of a Jeremiah or Isaiah or some kind of a big prophet. But I'm not a prophet. So I'm just saying that my should be good life, individual and collective good life. That is the meaning of the economy. Yeah? But for the past 4 decades, in the time of the neoliberalist era, the basic principle was stockholder value, shareholder value. You will know that. And the financial profit. And those things are the panacea that legitimizes all the atrocities and the terrible activities of humankind on the world. So first basic principle should be our good life rather than profit making. And second thing is, as our friend Michel has said, it should be based upon not on the state authority. It should not be based upon the capital market. It should be based upon the spontaneous organization of association.
Okay.
Associational attempt of ordinary people. Let me put emphasis why it is important. He said that nowadays global capital is intervening into our everyday life. All the things we eat, all the things we wear, all the things we use, and there is no power left in the hand of the ordinary people to have some control over that. We are entirely upon the mercy of the global financial capital in terms of everyday life. But if we end our state, government is almost powerless in terms of controlling and regulating the global capital and financial capital. In this time, what ordinary people really need is at least some very small amount of power that can actually give some control to their hands to have control over their everyday life. Then why should it begin with, not with the grand scale of fighting against the global financial capital also? I mean, let's forget about it for the time being. Why don't you start from how to intervene and how to have little more control over our everyday life, and how to provide all the vegetables we need every day, how to provide the basic clothes that we need every day. I think that is why we should, this is the, I think that the base second norm or standard that I'm using in order to distinguish it. This is a new emerging because it is not state-centered, it is not market-centered, it is centered upon the spontaneous association of ordinary people. I could say just two things at this.
Well, just a quick question. Really interesting ideas, thinking about the next 10 to 15 years as there's clashes of systems and so on, really fascinating. Something that I would find really interesting to hear you guys talk about is what your personal investment strategy is with any asset portfolios you've got. Because I find that actually the actions we undertake at a personal level are very revealing of our mindset, of our, short-term needs as compared to our, it's kind of like reality versus idealization of the future. And I don't mean this in an aggressive way, because I would totally understand if you're investing in the S&P 500 because traditionally that delivers great returns, but there's so many peer-to-peer systems and so on. If you could comment from a personal level as much as you're willing to reveal, I just think that would be fascinating to hear.
How to get rich in the kale.
Maybe yes.
Now you got everybody's attention.
Well,
Afloat.
well, I can tell you that my activism hasn't made me rich, and I actually have no money to invest. So what I'm doing is I'm investing in relations, and the first thing is my family. So I always make sure that I give time to my children, my wife, and as some of you know, I've been cancelled in 2018, by the identity politics stuff. And what's the only thing that makes me survive is that, I have a loving family. And the other thing is, when you don't have a lot, other people are very important, right? So, like when I travel, I never have to pay for a hotel, just never. There's always people, and I really see it as an investment because it doesn't come automatically. It requires hard work for people to be willing to do this, right? They have to trust you and think you're interesting, and so all these things. Unfortunately, so I can't give you investment advice, but I shouldn't say this actually because maybe the Belgian tax office is listening. But I did get a Bitcoin at the right moment, right? So I wasn't making any money for 2 years. And so I got one Bitcoin, which was worth $10,000. At the moment, the person told me he would give it to me. It was 12,500 when I got it. And then it was 60,000. I spent 2/3 of it. But even now, it's still double. So I can recommend to you, receive Bitcoins. Don't buy them, but receive them. That's a good investment strategy.
Make as many friends as you can around the world, so you don't need to spend for hotel.
That's what I'm saying. Absolutely. Yeah. Do you want to say?
Okay.
When you were talking peer-to-peer, I was really curious, was the Bitcoin part of this peer-to-peer that you're thinking about? Is that sort of...
I quickly, yeah. So,
Is Bitcoin common?
okay.
Okay, I'm using the term...
Yeah. So,
Is Bitcoin
so here's the thing.
communist?
I think Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general are a sign of this non-territorial organization, right? So we have state sovereign money, fiat money, which has a legitimacy and a value because it's linked to the taxation power of a state. But now we have money which has value because of the trust of a community in the algorithm, right? So I think Bitcoin was the first socially sovereign money. And I think it's very badly designed as a libertarian, extractivist, speculative money. On the other hand, if you're an activist like Julian Assange, and the government is cutting and debanking you, there's nothing else than Bitcoin to actually save you, right? So I have a mixed feeling about Bitcoin, but in yeah.
See it as the peer-to-peer one? Okay,
It has certain peer-to-peer aspects, like it has a very strong community dynamic around it, and the trust of a community, and it's a commons. The code is a commons, So it has very strong peer-to-peer and commons aspects alongside with strong market-driven, libertarian, Austrian economics. So it's a mix. It's a mix. And as we're going out of ideology, we're getting more and more mixed things where people just, take ideas, an idea from the left, an idea from the right, and they just kind of...
Wouldn't that be how anything develops? Like that sort of...
I think Bitcoin is too unstable to be a global standard. I think it's a global reserve currency.
Can I
Yeah.
just butt in quickly? Okay, hi, this is Simon. What I want to say is that if we're not talking about cryptocurrencies and central bank digital currencies, there's a massive hole in tonight's discussion because all the banks are doing it. All the governments are planning it. Okay? The US government is planning it. The Chinese government is implementing it. Bank transfers between Korea and Thailand are using XRP, which is a digital currency. Now, today, XRP, which is being sued by the Securities and Exchange Commission and what's called the SEC for the last 3 years, is a optimal central bank, optimal digital currency, which works very frictionless. And there are something like 33 international banks already implementing Ripple and digital currencies and XRP. The SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, has been suing Ripple and XRP to logjam and stop XRP becoming a major force in the cryptocurrency movement. And there have been 2 cryptocurrencies that have been given a green light by the SRC, Bitcoin and Ethereum, under dubious circumstances. And that is, it's clear that there are behind the scenes deals and people who are benefited from. Ethereum is clearly more of a security than XRP. But why is XRP being logjammed when Ethereum is being given a green light? Because the world is corrupt. The world is full of corruption. Okay, but one thing you can absolutely look around the world and what... No. One thing you can look around the world and see, it's inevitable. It's all going on everywhere. Okay, so now, both of you, and I've known Michel, where was this? You. We were just having a chat a second ago, and he said, what do you think of these 2 guys? And I said, well, I've known Michel for 15 years. I met you tonight. But what you said earlier on made me think, I think what Michel's talking about is European history, largely. What you're talking about is really interesting, a cyclic inevitability of chaos. And I tend to actually just resonate with what you said, because I feel like here's my prediction tonight. What we're about to see is a black swan event in the financial system, like 9/11. There's a 9/11 type black swan event coming where the governments are going to do some sort of reset, and it's going to be to do with central bank digital currencies. Now, pick your central bank digital currency. It's very, very difficult. But it's something in that area. And if we're not talking about that, we're actually missing like the elephant in the room. It's not a question, it's a statement like, put this on the agenda because it's definitely there.
So another different topic now, but maybe another elephant that we haven't talked about, which is climate change. I assume that both of you kind of looking for some ways to maneuver the chaos or hope that we can shorten the chaos. But we're talking about humans sorting out their issues, different systems in Europe, different beliefs, in the US, religious groups becoming more zealous and so on and so forth. But the climate is not waiting for us, and the problems of the climate as we are delaying our responses and we have Ukraine war and this and that, I just, for me, seem to be asking for more cooperation at a international and global level than being solvable through this sort of more localization. So perhaps both of you could discuss a little bit on how you see how maybe climate change is accelerating this collapse, or what we can do to also deal with that issue, because I think that's the one thing that's not waiting. It's just like aging, right? We all get older. Climate change is happening, and these things are all human-generated problems between our beliefs, race, ethnicity, religion. Thank you. Okay. Well, I think I should say something as a response to gentlemen. First, I would like to talk about this climate crisis thing. I would describe myself as a pessimist about this thing, because well, if the all the things that the scientists have said are right, and we are doomed unless we do something until 2050, then I think we are already doomed, because what the scientists do not know about and do not talk about is social system is another system. Atmospherical system is not the only system that is relevant here. How politics work, how society works, how human consensus are working, this is another system. And if we consider this, how the speed and the way that social system is working in terms of this climate crisis, and as far as I know, for the past 2 decades, we are doomed. Even if there is no Ukraine war, and even if there is no geopolitical conflict, we are already doomed. But so that's why I'm thinking about myself as a pessimist. I'm not denying the importance of doing something about this, and it's crucially important, and we should desperately need to do. But we should think about this kind of a systemic chaos and a systemic mess is something beyond our human will, individual human will. Let's say, let's take an example. Is it possible for me to persuade Putin guy to hug Biden guy and Xi Jinping guy and everybody in the world, and let's sing about the human harmony and so on? It is simply impossible. But nowadays the key is in the hands of people, hands of people like corporation leaders and Putin guy and so on. And in this time of crisis, I don't say there are there is much point in creating hopeless hope in the minds of the people. I would say just effect of this, anesthetic, just a painkiller. So that's why I'm calling myself as a pessimistic guy. I seriously doubt whether there is anything we can do in order to prevent that kind of geopolitical intervention into this climate crisis. That's my first thing to say. And concerning these the blockchain and the future of the financial system, let me go back to Peter Pogani, that the guy's idea. He was a long-time international economist working for the American government, and his point about the problem he got with the financial system since the World War II is the fiat monetary system. Our monetary system is not backed by any precious metal or anything. It is entirely backed by the government commandment and the government's power of taxation and so on. The problem is not the fiat money per se, but the real force that have been taking advantage of this fiat money system is the banking system and some of the financial powers and the investors group who are parasiting upon this kind of banking system. They have been enjoying enormous privilege of getting money in the first round directly from the banking system, and they have been taking advantage of, and is a final aftermath of it is the global casino system that is called the global financial system. So if the blockchain thing is, I think Michel's point is similar to mine. That is, the blockchain technology actually can be used in order to build more trust among peers. In order to have more trust and more among each other, we need to have more transparent bookkeeping and some other recording system. And blockchain can be very instrumental in enhancing this kind of trust. But the Bitcoin thing is, actually basic idea of it is the instrument that are working among the total strangers. the worst of it is total strangers who has absolutely no interest in having any trust in each other. That is the basic idea of Bitcoin. And that is why the cryptocurrency is like based upon this kind of, in my view, corrupted philosophy can be easily taken advantage by the existing fiat money system of the banking system and so on. So if we see the demise nowadays, only people who are getting benefit out of this fiat money system is just 1% of the population. Other 90% of the population are entirely isolated and alienated from this type of financial system. So if we have some options, then we need to multiply the monetary system. We need to have global monetary system, of course, but on the basis of the national scale, on the basis of the local scale. Why don't we, multiply the monetary system? Why don't we have a different set of monetary system and for different type of use? And I think this is the right way, and the blockchain technology could be a very strong and powerful infrastructure for building this kind of alternative solution. Not Bitcoin. Not Bitcoin for total strangers who gives a shit about each other.
Oh, perfect.
So that's my idea.
One last question, I reckon, if that's fine.
I just feel
1 second.
I have one question for sure, but I just want to respond because I've been in Chiang Mai through the whole Bitcoin is God state for the last 8 years here. And what you just said is it may have a noble root. Bitcoin and transparency is at its root. But the people who are behind it are as scummy as the people who are running the same banking system. And they're more hidden. And so it sucks. And so that's I was just inspired by the way you framed that. And my question to both you realist pessimists, which I don't see how anybody here tonight could have come out of this optimistic, because like what I'm hearing, which I kind of feel is true, is your most optimistic take about peer-to-peer is that, wow, locally we're going to be able to make some clothes and we're going to be able to grow some food, which basically means we're going back 60 fucking years. And that's the optimistic appraisal of you two guys. And so my question is this: is there anybody that you can point to that has a positive potential for the next 15 to 20 years that we could have a look at to maybe back? Because the peer-to-peer thing sounds like it's going to be a slow thing to eventuate. It's going to take 20 to 30 years. And in the middle of it, we're just going to be all witnessing a horrific decline with poor people being screwed. So do you guys, can you point to anything?
Well, actually, I consider myself an optimist. It's a question of scale. So I'll give you an example, just a concrete example. In Europe, like in France, every week 200 farms go bankrupt, every single week, and it's been going on for 10 years. Now, if I look at the Commons project, it's called Terre des Liens, land of links, land of connections. So it's a community land trust. So what do? They buy land. Then they make an ecological contract with their farmers. And they already have a significant impact on pollution and climate change in two French departments, Bretagne and Normandy, because they have zero fertilizer, they have zero pesticides, and so they have zero water pollution. So they actually save 360 million euro per year to the French state in depollution, right? So what I'm saying is, this is a great project. The problem is it doesn't scale. But it doesn't scale because it doesn't have any support, right? And so this is where politics comes back on the side. So the kind of work I'm doing is being an interface between commoners and politicians, actually, right? To have facilitating and enabling mechanisms, and it's not that nothing is happening. So, for example, in Italy, There is the Bologna regulation for the regeneration of urban commons, which is basically a coalition of the city, the commercial sector, the universities, and the non-profits, four. And they work for the fifth sector, which is the civic commons-oriented sector, right? And so what they do is whenever you have a project to make your place better, you negotiate with this city, and they make a commons accord. So they say, for example, sure, yeah, you can have your park, your commons park, and you can have pigs and everything, which normally is not allowed, on the condition that you treat your pigs well. And so they make an accord, right? And then they support the project. Well, this project alone is now applied in 250 Italian cities with 1 million people, right? And so this is still the power of the public authority, which has a common good in its view, and not just the commercial priorities. And so I think that's part of the solution, is scaling what works. And otherwise we have things like permaculture, which is, you might think it's small, right? What if I tell you, well, there's already 12,000 permaculture sites in the world? That's no longer that small, right? That becomes, because of the viral. And so I think that, first of all, the governments can play a role in shifting their vision to enabling civic autonomy.
But do you really believe, as you stated, like you
Yeah.
specifically said, there was essentially no left wing left? And you also said that, and you pointed out that, like, America, the Soviet Union, China, it's all heading in a very right-wing direction, and the right wing doesn't support these ideas.
Well, that depends, actually, but that's part. Yeah.
Last question. I think
Yeah.
it's a great one to end on, and then we can all relax and have chit chat.
No, I just want to say one thing, and then I'll shut up. So Mondragon, I think some of you might know it. Mondragon is the largest cooperative industrial entity in the world, with 80,000 workers in the Basque Country, and it was created under the Franco regime, right? So even with right-wing regimes, that doesn't mean there's nothing to do, because any regional authority is actually interested in saving its land and its region and having economic development. So what I'm saying is you have to talk with everybody, right? As a commoner and as a commoner group, you talk with whoever is in power and you say, this is what we need, this is what we want. And you put politics a bit between brackets, around the priority of this kind of change. That's what I think. So I don't no longer believe that the left will do the good thing and the right will do the wrong thing. I believe, you have to talk with, people who are concerned about the health of their local economy and wherever they come from, basically. Could be wrong, but that's my point. Yeah.
Well, I have just a few words to add to what he has already said. I should modify modify what I have said, as I'm the pessimist. What I meant is this: there is a two or one basic principle in Stoic philosophy. That is, forget about what you cannot control, concentrate on what you can do. That is the most effective way of living a life. And the reason why I am pessimistic about this geopolitics and whole global system is that's what I cannot control. What I can do about this Putin guy, other than being killed by him. Yeah, he's a great fighter and so on. And I want to, I'm in my mid-50s, and I don't have much time left in my life, and I don't want to concentrate my resources in what... And I want to concentrate what I can do. And concerning what I can do, I just want to emphasize another thing in here. We've been talking about the food, the vegetable things and clothes thing as if they are the major staples of the P2P commons production. But there are something more, maybe very, very important nowadays, that is intangibles. Knowledge, informations, and so on. Even in capitalist economy, those intangible things are creating much more added value than, soils and vegetables and clothes and so on. So when cloth is making a value, the linen or silk is not creating it. Design is creating the value of it. I'm not saying that this is a good situation, but I'm saying that nowadays intangible things are also very much relevant to the economic situation nowadays. The thing is here, one thing here is, I guess the most of the people here sitting here should be much more knowledgeable and much more intellectually active than ordinary people, in terms of average. Then why don't you find something to share with others? That is knowledge commons. For example, what I am trying to do with the Gyeonggi province government nowadays is trying to organize. There are tons of PhDs who are fired and not able to get a job in the universities. They are suffering and they are literally starving to death. So why don't you trying to organize them and giving some money out of the public resources and making them some kind of a very good videos of the lecturing series of the economics 101 and the sociology 101 and so on. And personally, I have begun to have my own YouTube channel. And I'm trying to create a video clip every week about the global politics and economics and so on. There is no monetary reward for me, but it could, hopefully, it could work as a kind of a rallying point for some people who can share my idea. So I think that's the beauty of this idea. No matter what is happening in geopolitics, we can and actually find something to start with, not just the vegetable growing, not just the cloth making, some knowledge sharing and some information making and some, creating some place very hot and very hip that everybody wants to get together, like this place. Yeah. Okay.